It's been a while since I posted a lazy Sunday upload, but I thought this excerpt of Brendon O'Neill talking about the corruption of political language was worth a post. Now, it might sound like a cliche to describe certain types of modern political language as Orwellian, but consider some examples. I've noted previously the language of diversity, which often refers to a very narrow conception of diversity like skin colour or gender, and totally ignores either diversity of thought or the natural diversity amongst individuals. In fact, diversity is often code for conformity. If you're not on board with the diversity agenda, then you'll be cast out, as James Damore discovered. Or similarly, the word inclusive is often invoked when what is actually being practiced is exclusion. Stanford University announced just last week that they were banning men for the gym for 4 hours a week under the banner of inclusivity. Or how about equality, which has morphed from the common understanding of equality under the law and equality of opportunity to equality of outcome, although not explicitly stated. And the language of equality continues to change. You now hear phrases like substantive equality or equity, which obscure, intentionally I believe, their real meaning. Anyway, this excerpt is taken from a Battle of Ideas forum last year titled The Corruption of Political Language, and Brendon O'Neill does a great job of laying out some examples of how confusing our political language has become. Enjoy.
If you want to see what a mess both politics and language are in at the moment, you just have to consider the fact that last week Downing Street issued a statement saying it was okay to use the phrase pregnant women. So this is the seat of political power in Britain, informing the populace that it is acceptable to say that women get pregnant. It is acceptable to say that pregnancy is something that happens to a woman, not to a man. And basically, Downing Street is saying it's okay for you to express and give voice to biological facts, which the vast majority of people around the country will have thought was a very strange thing for Downing Street to have to remind us of. Now, of course, this was in response to a controversy involving the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office had to give advice to the United Nations on the wording of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that covenant contains a line which says pregnant women should not be given the death penalty. And the Foreign Office said, we have a bit of a problem with the phrase pregnant women because it might be offensive to, the 17 people who have given birth while claiming or identifying as men. And so it said to the UN, please say pregnant people to avoid giving offence. And it caused such a stink that eventually Downing Street had to come out and say, look, it's okay to say pregnant women. This is an incredibly bizarre situation that we have to try and get our heads around. Firstly, the fact that the Foreign Office has gone, even the Foreign Office, even the kind of stuffy Foreign Office, which extends Britain's influence around the world, full of suits and civil servants and probably quite boring people, even the Foreign Office has gone down the rabbit hole of postmodernist trans speech, where even the words men and women are being called into question. And the second bizarre thing, of course, is that Downing Street has to give us a green light that it's okay to say pregnant women, a phrase that people use every single day, and that's how they understand the world they live in. And I think what that story really points to is that we face something really worrying today, a crisis of political language that is actually quite profound and disturbing. A crisis of political language that I think expresses a crisis of politics more broadly, and beyond that, a crisis of meaning, a collapse of meaning, a collapse of the basic categories through which people have traditionally understood politics, the world, and their place in the world. A collapse of the ideas and substance and meaning of everyday life, in essence. So I think the unanchoring of political language, the confusions of political language today, both express and intensify a crisis of public life and even a crisis of common sense. So we actually face something more than what Orwell wrote about in his famous essay, which is not just the misuse of political language, not just the use of political language to mystify rather than clarify and to disguise rather than enlighten. We still have that, of course. We still have the propagandistic misuse of language, but we have something else too, something even worse, a situation where political language has become disconnected from reality and has increasingly become this very crude tool for the expression of narrow, contradictory, mystifying, and even unhinged ideas. So I just want to look at three ways in which I think political language is in crisis today. The first is that thing Orwell and others wrote about, that ongoing, often quite conscious, and sometimes quite sinister misuse of political language to, in Orwell's words, make murder look respectable. We still got that. We still have that. We still have people who very consciously misuse language to hide what they're really doing or to hide what they really think. So this is an era in which peacekeeping is presented to us as something that the United Nations does, something that the British military does, when we know that what they're really doing is war. War is increasingly presented to us as peacekeeping. The United Nations will intervene in a foreign, normally already war-ravaged country. It will often support one side, demonize another. It might even get involved in arming certain groups. It might get involved in raping women, as has happened in certain places where the UN has posted troops. It will inevitably end up entrenching the divisions in that country, intensifying the conflict, deepening the bloodshed, and it calls it a peacekeeping operation. War is now peace, or peace is war. This is an era in which Western governments, the British government and the American government, will bomb other countries and refer to it as humanitarian intervention. That shockingly Orwellian political phrase that was invented by the likes of Tony Blair and much of the Labour Party of the time, which supported him, and also the liberal press, which presented the bombing of Yugoslavia in particular in 1999 as humanitarian intervention. They used the language of caring, saving, humanitarianism, protection, while they were killing hundreds of people, including hundreds of refugees. On more than one occasion, they bombed columns of refugees who were fleeing Yugoslavia and killed them. Women, pregnant women, children, all blown to bits, all of it referred to as humanitarian intervention. A deeply sinister misuse of language. Barbarism disguised as humanitarianism, destruction disguised as construction, as rescue. And then on the domestic front, I think one of the misuses of political language that I find most intriguing and concerning is around the word incapacity, particularly in relation, of course, to incapacity benefit, which is a thing that was introduced in the 1970s, really took off in the 1980s. It's in that decade where the number of people receiving incapacity benefit goes up exponentially and eventually reaches around 1 million. And then in more recent times, incapacity has been reimagined as disability or incapability, and other words get attached to this idea. But that's also incredibly deceitful language. That is the presentation of societal failure, in this instance, the society's failure to provide people with gainful employment, the presentation of societal failure as individual incapacity. The presentation of the limitations of capitalist society and its inability to provide everyone with work as a failing on the part of the individual. It's his or her incapacity that is the problem. And of course, if you look at the 1980s, what happens, hundreds of thousands of people are thrown out of work, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and mining and other traditional forms of industry, and they're redefined as incapable. And they come to think of themselves tragically and inevitably as incapable. And so what we have in those instances, and there are numerous other instances, is the misuse of language, the very sinister misuse of language to disguise what's really going on politically and to cover up war, destruction, unemployment, and other deeply problematic things that happen in modern society. The second way in which political language is in crisis is the way in which some political terms and phrases and descriptions have become so emptied of substance that they now mean the opposite of what they once meant. And there are a few examples of this that I want to give. The first is the word progressive. Whenever I hear someone describe themselves as progressive now, I know that they are not progressive. It's the easiest way to work out if someone's progressive. You can see this all the time. Almost everyone who describes themselves as progressive is actually opposed to progress, is actually largely very uncomfortable with the ideas of the Enlightenment and with the ideas of a future-orientated humanist desire to expand man's influence over nature, to develop the forces of production, to move forward and progress. Even environmentalists call themselves progressive, and you just know they're taking the mick. I've heard people say, we are progressives opposed to fracking, and you just want to shake them by their collars and say, that means you're not progressive. You are opposing a progressive step, a new form of industry, something that could give people employment and create more energy. That's not progressive. The other word that has utterly changed meaning is anti-racist. To be anti-racist now is to be hyper-conscious about race. To be anti-racist now is to think racially all the time. It is to say to people, you're white, you're black, you're this, you're that. It is to behave in the way racist people used to behave, although it's done in a very politically correct way. To be anti-racist now is to go and see a movie in the cinema and count the number of black faces and then write a Tumblr post later about how terrible it is that Hollywood won't employ enough black people. It is to be myopically racial, obsessively racial. That to me is the opposite of what anti-racist used to mean, which was to get rid of the whole nonsense idea of race. Free speech now means the opposite of what it used to mean. Free speech used to mean you wanted free speech. Now, very often, people will argue for censorship under the guise of freedom of speech. One example of that is Yvette Cooper, who is pushing this thing called Reclaim the Internet, which wants new rules and regulations on the internet so people can't say certain things. And she says this is not about limiting free speech, this is about expanding it. Because if we allow trolls to speak online, other people feel that they can't speak. So in calling for the regulation of speech, she says she is defending freedom of speech. Utterly Orwellian. Censorship is freedom. The other two words that now are emptied of meaning is conservative and Labour. The Conservative Party is no longer interested in conserving things, and the Labour Party no longer knows anyone who labours for a living. The Conservative Party, if you just look at their Gender Identity Act, which would allow anyone to claim to be any gender regardless of reality, looks to me like a complete and utter embrace of postmodernism, a destruction of tradition at its very core. That is the end of any suggestion that the Conservative Party is the Conservative Party. Labour increasingly looks to me like a movement against ordinary people rather than for ordinary people. A movement that wants to police and control what people see and eat and how often they can gamble, and which sees them as a problem to be solved rather than a people to be represented. The left increasingly means being against ordinary people rather than for them, and the Brexit debate proves that too. And then the third and final way in which political language is corroded today is, I think, the most important, which is that political language has increasingly surrendered to the culture wars. Political language is increasingly a tool of identity and validation rather than of description and the expression of convictions. And it's really interesting, I think, that the two of the most common political terms today that are used to describe people are very rarely used by people themselves to describe themselves. And those two phrases are politically correct and neoliberal. I find it fascinating that we see those phrases bandied around all the time. You're politically correct, you're a neoliberal. But it's incredibly, incredibly rare that anyone describes themselves as politically correct or anyone describes themselves as neoliberal. Because that is political language that is not used to describe something accurately. It's used to brand. It's used to other people. It's used in the culture wars, in the identity wars to say, I'm good, you're evil. It's a marker rather than a tool of description. And you see that again and again today, particularly in the misuse of terms like fascist and communist. So people on the left will call anyone who even remotely disagrees with Angela Merkel's welcoming of 800,000 migrants into Germany, you're a fascist if you have any issue with that whatsoever. You're instantly a fascist. They're like Rick from The Young Ones. Everyone is a fascist. And then on the right, anyone who likes the NHS and wants to expand it and thinks certain things should be done by the government rather than by the free market is a Marxist, a communist, a firebrand. They keep saying this about Corbynistas. And of course, it's not true. As someone recently said, Corbynism is basically just microwaved Milibandism. It's not Marxism. That's the key problem, I think, with political language right now, which is that it is increasingly used within the culture wars not to accurately describe yourself or to accurately describe your enemies, but simply to puff up yourself and demonize others. And that gives rise to a situation where it can be very difficult to work out the truth of politics and the truth of where people stand. The one word that is most demonized and which I think we should reclaim is the word populist. That's the word that is the most demonic word today. Everyone who opposes the European Union, a deeply authoritarian, bureaucratic, backward institution, is branded a populist. And in relation to that, I say bring it on. Populist means being interested in and wanting to engage with the popular will. And I think the more that we can reorient politics around doing that, the more we can move away from the dishonest, destructive, self-interested misuse of political language. Thank you.